we can see that what's at stake is that you're in emotional labor situations, the front stage and backstage may not be as clearly distinguished. This is particularly the case like when I go to Disneyland and I see the people who are cleaning up cigarette butts off the ground being super happy about it. Right? They're not allowed to be unhappy. And they also need to be able to point you to the bathroom and say, hi, I hope you're having a great time. And here, why don't you just give me your cigarette butt? Like, there's really demeaning labor. And at the same time, they are having to be a very nice and happy person about it, which is kind of like double work. There's also this interesting collapse between the public and the private because the mind has to embrace the emotionality of the performance. And then there's also this, you start to get to these boundaries of home and work at the same time. If we want to talk about how this happens in the workplace, there's another great place to look, and it's this book by Paul Willis called Learning to Labor, where in a more casual sense, these boys in the Midlands in the United Kingdom would experience, they'd be happy to go to work at a factory because they're convincing themselves that that's where they belong. And so by virtue of interacting with each other within a very structured way, they reproduce their class. So they're not able to get out of the working class because they convince each other that they are laborers, right? And in this case, they're not performing so much emotional labor as they are performing certain attitude toward themselves, and then like groupthink, they're engaging in a process of interaction that reproduces that way of being over and over again, so that then they never are able to escape their class situation. All right, so I'm going to leave the topic of work again and let us go back to identity for a moment to say, what are some of the important distinctions for thinking about identity? Well, if you think about identity and social interaction, it's one thing to talk about what identity is or what it seems to be, like I have an identity. Sometimes I think it is holistic, or that I have an identity, it's mine. But then there's a distinction between that and how identity happens. So in order to get to a perspective on thinking about how identity, or how we negotiate identity in social media or digital context, you have to think about not what identity is, as much as how identity happens. So when I think about all the Snapchat that I do, right, the multiple times that identity is happening over and over and over again, and what is that, and how does that play out over time, is not necessarily going to be answered by what identity is, but more of the process of coming to understand what your identity is doing. Again, there's a distinction between how identity is felt. It might be felt as a unified, coherent thing, or it might be understood actually in its formation as being something that's more fluid. And this same distinction is visible when we look at how individuals describe identity versus how theories describe identity. Anyway, it's an important set of distinctions to think about, because when we start to move into the internet, we start to look at types of identity, like virtual identities, multiple identities, saturated identities, networked, informational, algorithmic identities. And it's difficult to understand what those mean unless we go back to the idea that it's not what they mean, it's what happens in those places. So it's how does identity happen over and over again. There's some great people that I would point to think about some of these characteristics and how this happens. Kenneth Gergen talks about this in The Saturated Self, and also in his work on the relational being. Sherry Turkle talks about this, and she has this vision across three works of hers, that we cycle through identities and that we play with multiple virtual selves. She started talking about this in 1984 and has really shifted her perspective over time, and as she gets older. But in her work, I think it's really interesting to think about how identity is not just about individuals, it's about information. So identity here is about information flow. And again, then, like we talked about in terms of symbolic interactionism, identity happens as we interact. That's information flowing back and forth. And then when we go online, we can think about how that plays out in avatar worlds as very much a part of information flow. A couple of other notable people to think about in this sense would be Terry Senft or Alice Marwick, who talk about identity practices and self-branding or micro-celebrity. And then we can start talking about emotion in the workplace again, because the concept of micro-celebrity, or the concept of the self as a brand, is one that involves not naturally, but has come to involve creating yourself as an entity that is for sale, right? You can see this in fashion bloggers, as one of our PhD students is talking about, and you can see it in Instagrammers, and you can see it in Justin Bieber or Taylor Swift, who both became celebrities out of their YouTube use and the spread of themselves through those networks. So the creation of themselves, or the creation of the self, or the idea that you would try to create yourself as a brand, is something that can often be done in exchange for money now. But you do it whether or not there's money involved, because you're doing it. I think that earlier we talked about this as aspirational labor. That what you're doing when you fix your LinkedIn profile, and when you do all that identity work in trying to find the right pose, the right glasses, the right look, the right way of describing yourself, the right poise, the right interactions, the right networking, all of those activities are in some way designed to help you manage your impression, so that others then can see you as a commodity worth investing in, or a worker, or somebody worth hiring, right? And so we have a lot of responsibility now in multiple kinds of media to present ourselves as a commodity, and to then build a brand that is something that's likely to that is likely to have value for somebody else, value in the form of a paycheck or money that you then get, right? And so it's worth thinking about in what ways are our everyday interactions then performing a certain kind of labor. And is that an emotional labor? Is it aspirational labor? Is it something we might call affective labor? Or is it labor at all? Do we need to work for an employer in order for it to be called labor? What kind of work is it? It's certainly unpaid work if it's about us modifying our personalities online and creating and spending a lot of time online in order to make ourselves amenable and acceptable to others as something they want to buy. I want to leave it there to then say that when we might think about something like identity, work, and emotions, it's not enough to just say that these three things are parts of a very simple process, or that they're separate processes at all. These are very entangled concepts, that emotions are something that are supposed to be about feelings or expression of a feeling. And we can talk about whether or not we like the word affect or emotion. And there are certainly very distinctive differences between those two things. But when emotion becomes a matter of labor, it means that it becomes part of a larger capitalist endeavor. And so the reason I bring to the foreground all the topic about workplace and the workplace dynamic and how it is that we've understood work over the last 100 years is because the way that we think about identity and emotions when we are engaging in our LinkedIn selves, we're thinking about ourselves also as workers. And there's value behind our work or behind our interactions for someone. These platforms that we use are not neutral or natural. They are corporate entities designed to make money. People who engage in micro-celebrity sorts of activities, or people who become celebrities, or people who engage in any kind of digital work at all, are part of that larger labor process. And so for me, thinking about identity work and labor, we must start to think about what that labor is in a larger sense. What role is the labor playing? Who is benefiting? If not us, then who? And we can think about this in many, many cases. Take the case of open source software, or beta testing, or commenting on Amazon products, rating them. I mean, what kind of work are you doing, or are we doing, that has value for someone else? And once we start to think about that, we can start to think about what are some of the micro practices involved in that, and then move to some interesting questions about that. So I'll leave it there. Do you have any questions or thoughts?